Imagine a world where Atari, the company that practically invented home gaming, comes roaring back with a machine so powerful, so bold, and so ahead of its time that it was supposed to leapfrog an entire generation of consoles. A world where the next big thing in gaming wasn't the Super Nintendo, or the PlayStation, or even the Sega Saturn, but a strange, angular box with a controller the size of a paperback novel and a marketing campaign that dared you to do the math. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that world didn't quite work out the way Atari hoped, because today we're telling the story of the Atari Jaguar, a console built on ambition, tangled in complexity, and remembered as one of gaming's most fascinating misfires. It's a story full of bold ideas, custom chips, canceled siblings, hardware quirks, virtual reality headsets that never made it to shelves, and the final swing of a company trying desperately to stay in the fight. So settle in, because we're about to explore the console that promised 64 bits of power, struggled to deliver on its potential, and still managed to leave a legacy far bigger than its install base. So let's follow this big cat into the wild, claws, quirks, and all, on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 274th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we're looking back at the Atari Jaguar. Not just the console itself, but the wild journey Atari took to get there. From the collapse of its 8-bit glory days, to the abandoned Panther, to the ambitious leap straight into 64-bit territory, the Jaguar story is one of big swings, complicated hardware, and a legacy far more interesting than its sales charts ever hinted. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, who'd probably try to wrangle all of the Jaguar's processors at once and end up blaming the 68,000 for everything. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, if I handed you a Jaguar, would you try to make sense of its hardware, or would you just try to survive its library first?
Well, I gotta try the library and then figure out the hardware from there.
Yeah, that's what us gamers do most of the time, isn't it?
I don't think most gamers want to tear apart their console, but sure.
That's a fact. But figuring out the hardware as a programmer just means figuring out how to program for it or develop for it. You can get a dev kit.
Software. We're
Fine.
talking. Yeah, that's
Fine.
software.
Yeah, but
Hardware's different.
Technicality. When I wrote the question, it'll make more sense when I tell you the story, because I was thinking about, yeah, it'll make more sense.
Well, before that, Dave, I think that people want to hear about the current week in gaming history. So why don't I take it away?
Okay.
Well, kicking it off on November 27th, 1992, King Arthur's World was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, developed by Argonaut Software and published by Jaleco. This inventive strategy puzzle hybrid put players in command of King Arthur's army, guiding troops through trap-filled fortresses and enemy strongholds using careful planning, timing, and resource management. With its blend of medieval fantasy, tactical unit placement, and physics-driven hazards, the game offered a unique twist on the SNES library, often described as a side-scrolling answer to Lemmings. Praised for its challenging creativity, King Arthur's World became a cult favorite among fans of strategic gameplay. We actually explored the broad roots of Arthurian legend and its many video game interpretations back in episode 140, so give it a listen if you'd like to dive deeper into the myth and its digital adaptations.
Yeah, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Which are in your favorite game of all time?
Which one's that?
Run Escape.
Oh, yeah, okay, I get what you're saying. Yeah, Yeah, it's a little less obvious, but
They're in it though.
you're right. They are. I mean, Merlin is literally a part of it, so
Right.
come on.
Exactly.
Next up, on November 27, 1993, Illusion of Gaia was introduced for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. Developed by Quintet and published by Enix, this action RPG followed the journey of Will, a young adventurer with mysterious powers as he traveled across real world-inspired locations like the Great Pyramid and Angkor Wat to confront an ancient cosmic threat. Blending fast-paced combat, puzzle-filled dungeons, and emotional storytelling, Illusion of Gaia stood out for its unique transformation mechanic, allowing Will to assume powerful forms like Frieden the Dark Knight. Praised for its atmosphere, memorable characters, and ambitious globe-spanning narrative, the game became a beloved cult classic of the SNES. Its blend of history, fantasy, and heartfelt themes continues to make it one of the standout titles of the 16-bit era.
Yeah. That's one of those that God, I just think back to so many great like SNES RPGs gave way to the PlayStation RPGs, and that was just such a freaking fantastic era for role playing games.
Well, I'm sure it was, but yeah, it was a little before my time.
It was.
Next up, on November 24th, 1995, Marathon 2 Durandal was released for the Macintosh, developed and published by Bungie. Building on the foundation of the original Marathon, this sequel expanded the series' ambitious sci-fi storytelling and fast-paced FEC action, with larger environments, more complex levels, and a significant graphics upgrade thanks to full 16-bit color support. The game followed the security officer as he was forced into an uneasy alliance with the rogue AI Durandal, exploring alien ruins and battling the Four across a sprawling interplanetary conflict. Marathon 2 also introduced robust network multiplayer, including cooperative play and competitive modes, that became a favorite among Mac gamers. Critically praised for its narrative depth, atmospheric world building, and innovative design, Marathon 2 helped solidify Bungie's reputation long before Halo and still remains a landmark title in Macintosh gaming history.
Bungie before they were the Bungie that we know that we know and love today.
Yeah, I would never have gotten that. The only Macintosh I had is the Apple II, and it didn't really play games that well, so,
Well, they are remaking the series, the Marathon series. That's what Bungie's working on at the moment. So there is hope for you to play them yet.
Well, we'll see what happens, but you never know.
We'll play it.
Okay, there you go. And speaking of games that we'll play on November 23rd, 2004, World of Warcraft was released for PC, inviting players into Azeroth and redefining what an MMORPG could be. Building on the lore and success of the earlier Warcraft strategy games, Blizzard transformed their fantasy universe into a living online world filled with quests, dungeons, and storylines that could be experienced solo or with friends. With its approachable design, readable UI, and forgiving mechanics, WoW opened a genre to the massive new audience, lowering the barrier to entry that had kept many away from MMOs. Its stylized art, memorable zones, and steady flow of expansions kept players logging in for years, turning guilds, raids, and social events into part of everyday life for millions. At its peak, World of Warcraft became a cultural phenomenon and a defining force in online gaming. We took a deeper look at its history and legacy back in episode 221, so give that a listen if you'd like to learn more and look into Azeroth's past.
And just learn all about losing hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of your time.
Hey, but we've been there.
That's kind of what
And
we
we'll be
talked
again.
about. Yeah, very true. If it's not one game, it's another.
Oh yeah, and WoW is one of those ones that keeps creeping back. And last up for this week in gaming history, on November 23rd, 2005, Animal Crossing Wild World was released for the Nintendo DS, developed by Nintendo EAD and published by Nintendo. As the second game in the Animal Crossing series, Wild World brought the charming life simulation formula to handheld play, introducing online connectivity that let players visit each other's towns for the first time. The game expanded customization options, added new holidays and events, and featured a rolling curved world that enhanced the sense of living in a cozy, ever changing village filled with memorable animal neighbors. Praised for its relaxing gameplay loop, portability, and social features, Wild World became one of the DS's biggest hits and helped cement Animal Crossing as a beloved global franchise.
We did an Animal Crossing episode, not Wild World though, the beginning of the series. I don't remember its number. Go check it out.
Yeah, go look it up, and then while you're there, see if there's any other episodes that might interest you. Like Dave mentioned, Run Escape. That's another good one. So, just look there, see what game you enjoy, and go listen.
Indeed. Rob, do you have any familiarity with the Jaguar?
It's a pretty nice car, depending on the model.
Yeah. How about the video game console?
I've had a lot of video game consoles, Dave. Can you be more specific?
Yes, the one called the Atari Jaguar.
Oh, yeah. I don't know that one.
Okay. All right. Great start. We're off to a great start.
Always are, Dave.
We're
That's why you start with me.
nothing but classy around here. We know, Rob, that once upon a time, the video game industry followed a simple trajectory. You start with 8 bits, you climb to 16 bits in the next generation, and then the next generation after that kind of, I guess, blended the 32 and 64-bit consoles. And then by the time we got to the 64-bit generation, this terminology really wasn't relevant to the console conversation. It's not like you heard anyone ever talk about the 128-bit consoles after that.
Right.
Nintendo made the jump with the NES into the Super Nintendo and finally into the Nintendo 64. Sega went from, its Master System into the Sega Genesis, I guess kind of into the 32X. And then we got there with the Sega Saturn. I mean, NEC, we did a whole episode on the TurboGrafx 16 bits. Even they transitioned upwards into 32 bits with their PCFX. It was just the way that technology was progressing as we moved through console generations in the 80s and 90s. Atari had a rough ride through that same time period. After the video game crash of 1983, there was still life left in Atari's 8-bit computer line. Their PCs. We had one in the house. These were the Atari 800s, the XLs, and eventually the XE series. These all carried the brand name through the mid 80s. They weren't really cutting edge anymore by that point, but they sold well enough, especially in Europe where they were more popular, to keep the lights on. The XE name even made the jump to a console in late 1987 with what's known as the XE game system, which was basically just a cost reduced XE computer in a plastic shell. But Atari knew that the 8-bit era couldn't last forever. The rest of the industry was already, by that point, late 80s, pushing into 16-bit territory. Sega worked with the Genesis. Nintendo was preparing the Super Famicom. On the computer side of things, you had the Amiga and the ST computers that were proving what 16-bit graphics and sound could really do. And so everyone was upping the ante by going to 16 bits. Atari wanted in. They needed a successor that could genuinely compete with everyone else. It was the only way they were going to stay relevant at that point. And so the company explored a new path forward, a console that was based partly on ST technology, something like a Super XE. NES became Super NES, XE would become Super XE. That idea, that early proposal, didn't last very long, but that name kind of stuck around long enough to signal Atari's intentions. They wanted to grow the XE family into a proper 16-bit system that could stand beside Sega and Nintendo and not necessarily behind them like Atari was at that point. And so Atari decided to reach out to a small engineering company called Flare Technology for help in building its next generation of consoles. But then the question arises, why Flare? Why did Atari, a company with a long, successful history of building its own hardware, suddenly partner with a tiny team of ex-Sinclair engineers operating out of the UK? And the answer basically is Flair was doing things that Atari couldn't ignore. By the late 80s, Atari had spent years trying to keep up in the home computer market, and honestly, as we know, it wasn't going well. The ST family, which was their upgrade, was losing ground to the Amiga. PCs, IBM PCs, were starting to look more attractive, and Atari's research and development budget just wasn't large enough to reinvent the wheel on its own and come up with its own thing to compete. They needed something new, they needed something impressive, but realistically, they genuinely needed it on a budget. And that is where Flair technology comes in. Flair had this reputation for squeezing a surprising amount of performance out of low cost components. Their earlier prototype, which was called the Flair 1, wasn't a commercial machine, but it showed off exactly the kind of forward thinking design that Atari desperately needed. It had custom chips, it had a strong graphics output, it had a digital audio processor, fast built-in and DSP work that really felt closer to a next generation multimedia machine than a traditional home computer. And even better for Atari than that, Flair worked cheap. They weren't a giant. The studio wasn't a giant R&D lab. They weren't multi-million-dollar engineering teams. They were just a small handful of people who knew how to use clever chip design to stretch performance without necessarily stretching the budget. Now, Atari in the world had also seen the work Flair did on what's called the Konix multisystem. That was another ambitious, ahead of its time platform that didn't make it to market for business reasons, not necessarily technical ones. It was technically impressive. The hardware impressed Atari enough that when the time came to pick a partner for their next console, Flair's name rose quickly to the top. And so Atari approached them with a simple proposition: help us build our next generation of hardware. And Flair's answer was sure, but not with the older designs. Instead, they pitched a brand new direction, one that would rely on a pair of custom processors, heavy use of DSPs, and an architecture designed to squeeze every bit of performance the memory bus could allow. That pitch became what's known as the Panther. Now, the Panther was Atari's first real attempt to step into the 16-bit era with a machine designed to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. And honestly, on paper, it looks like it could have held its own. Flair's design combined a familiar Motorola 68000 processor with a custom video chip and a powerful sound processor capable of handling far more audio channels than all the other competition. Its graphics side had some clever ideas too, borrowing concept from Atari's workstation hardware and even offering scaling effects that would have put it in the same neighborhood as Mode 7 on the SNES. And unlike some of Atari's more sketched on a napkin hardware ideas over the years, the Panther wasn't just a concept. It was real, it was tangible, it could be built, and it was being built. Studios had early development kits, and internally, the casing design was close enough to final that Atari was genuinely preparing to move it into production. If you looked at the timeline, the Panther was originally targeting the early 1990s, meaning it would have entered the market late in the 16-bit era, but not impossibly late. Atari thought that the hardware advantage could make up for the timing, and at one point they even hinted at a 1991 launch to go head to head with the 16-bit heavyweights. But while the Panther team was working to catch up with the rest of the industry, something else was happening inside Atari. That is the other Flair project. The Flair guys were a bunch of engineers who liked technology and liked doing things with it and liked pushing the boundaries of what was possible. So running parallel to the Panther was a more experimental design. Again, this was led by the same Flair engineers, but this was one that wasn't just trying to match Sega and Nintendo, but jump a whole generation ahead of them.
So they're essentially designing two consoles at the exact same time.
They were designing two consoles at the same time. Yes, they've got the Panther going, made of like real tangible things, and Atari has got its marketing campaigns, its designs, everything around them. They're all geared up for the Panther, but at the same time, these engineers, almost like a hobby, are building another machine, and this one relied on custom RISC processors, more advanced rendering ideas, and memory saturating architecture that was far, far, far more ambitious than anything in the 16-bit landscape. And that project began progressing much faster than anyone expected. So by 1991, Atari looked at both systems. The Panther, which was nearly finished but destined to fight yesterday's battle, so to speak, and the other project, which was called the Jaguar, promising far more impressive results. And Atari made a very Atari decision. They canceled the Panther outright. This wasn't a slow fade out. This wasn't a polite shelving. Developers received letters explaining that all Panther work was stopping immediately and that Atari would support them as they shifted their efforts to the new machine. Literally, the Panther had made it all the way to the 1 yard line, and then Atari threw the whole playbook away.
I mean, at least it's not like they just did it to get rid of everything, but they're like, yeah, let's just go with the better one. And it was still the same team that made it, so like, you know.
Sure, there's logic in there. So instead of following the same orderly, 8 to 16 to 32-bit progression as everyone else, Atari just decides to skip the middle step entirely. Their next console wouldn't be a competitor to the Genesis or to the SNES. In their minds, and not technically, it would leapfrog them. And that leap, ambitious, risky, maybe a little bit desperate, is what genuinely brings us to the machine at the heart of today's story. Now that we've traced Atari through the 8-bit era, the abandoned Panther project, and the surprising decision to skip straight over the 16-bit generation, it's finally time to look at what they built instead. So, Rob, let's talk about the Jaguar.
All right, let's do it. Vroom, vroom.
Vroom vroom. Atari made a big deal about calling this the first quote unquote 64-bit home console. And that was a huge part of its identity. Its marketing tagline was literally do the math.
What, 64?
Exactly.
Okay.
But like most things with the Jaguar, the truth is a bit more complicated than the marketing tagline. Inside the Jaguar, everything revolved around two custom chips that the Flair team designed. They were named Tom and Jerry because apparently the cat theme was here to stay. Tom was basically the main workhorse for anything visual. It wasn't one big processor, it was actually a collection of three different pieces. There was a 32-bit graphics processor unit, which we call the GPU, which is where most of the game logic and graphics code was supposed to run. Tom included a 64-bit object processor, which handles building each frame on the fly, draws the screen basically, and Tom also has a 64-bit blitter, which is basically blitters are used to do fast graphic operations like the shading and the Z buffering.
Okay, I'm glad you explained that because I had no idea what a blitter was.
On top of that, Tom handled memory access and could talk to the RAM in either 8, 16, 32, or 64-bit chunks, depending on which part of the chip needed something. So Tom was kind of a mixed bag, you see. It was part 32-bit, part 64-bit, but all kind of tied together in a way that was very impressive on paper. Jerry followed a similar design philosophy, but focused on audio. It had a 32-bit signal processor and a bunch of other components meant to make the console sound fantastic. And while Jerry didn't have any 64-bit pieces, it didn't really need them. It handled sound just fine with what it had. And then off to the side, acting as the system's traffic cop, was the Motorola 68000, which is literally the same 16-bit, 32-bit, because it's capable of calculations. It's literally the same processor from the Sega Genesis. Atari put the 68,000 in there, intending it to schedule tasks and read controller inputs, not necessarily run the whole game. Tom and Jerry were going to run the game, and the Motorola processor was going to kind of, tell everything where to go. And that was the idea. That was the architecture behind it. So when Atari actually started gearing up to actually sell this thing, they needed a message, something bold enough to grab attention and drown out the fact that Nintendo and Sega basically owned the market by this point. And Atari landed on the one thing the Jaguar could claim that the competition couldn't: 64 bit.
I mean, that's a pretty big thing at this point, Dave.
But realistically, where'd the idea come from? I mean, we know in the early 90s that bits were marketing gold. Bigger numbers meant better systems, at least in the eyes of the average consumer. Sega had made an entire career at that point out of telling people that the Sega Genesis was quote unquote 16-bit power, and it worked because, as we learned in the Sega, recently, Sega was carving a chunk. They made a real dent in the gaming market.
Well, this was an opportunity to do it again.
I know. So Atari looks at their hardware and they say, well, we do have real 64-bit pieces. The motor is 64-bit, the object processor is 64-bit, the memory bus is 64-bit. I guess that counts, right?
Yeah, I guess maybe kinda, but I feel a little cheap
Well,
because
that's
that
exactly it.
32-bit GPU.
I know. Depending on how generous you are feeling, the answer is either, yeah, Atari is technically justified, or absolutely not. What the heck are you talking about? Because while those components were genuinely 64 bit, the parts developers actually programmed for to do things, that 32-bit GPU you just mentioned, that 32-bit digital signal processor you just mentioned, and that poor Motorola 68,000, these are all 32-bit designs. Still, it was marketing gold, so Atari ran with it, right? They doubled down. They stamped it in every commercial, every print ad, every box. They wrapped it all in, like I said, one of the most infamous taglines of the era: do the math. And some magazines poked fun at the logic. Others argued that Atari wasn't wrong, just very selective. Either way, it worked. Atari had done something important. People were talking about the Jaguar. And that set the stage for its big moment. Atari publicly unveiled the Jaguar in August of 1993 at the Chicago Consumer Entertainment Show, and for the first time in years, it looked like Atari had a real shot at a comeback. The hardware sounded futuristic, the marketing was loud, and after the show, or by the end of the show rather, more than 150 developers expressed interest in developing for the platform. The message was simple, right? This is the next generation. Not the SNES, not the Genesis, not even the 3DO. We are the future. And for a brief moment, people really believed them. Retailers were curious, fans were hopeful. I remember being so excited for it because it was a 64-bit system, because yeah, we were all brainwashed by bits at the time. Just be honest. That's how we measured system performance. 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, 64. It was at one point it was that simple. And so going right from your 64-bit SNES to your 64-bit Atari Jaguar, like, yeah, we were excited.
I mean, yeah, that's an understandable feeling, given that.
It was thrilling. It was cool. I remember reading about it in magazines. I played it. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We were. I mean, the word at the time would have been stoked. we were stoked. It would have been awesome. It was awesome.
Well, fair enough. Guess we'll hear more about it soon.
The press was cautiously skeptical, but when the Jaguar hit store shelves later that year in limited test markets, the honeymoon period didn't last long. Because all of the flashy 64-bit marketing in the world couldn't hide what players and the reviewers saw the moment they turned the system on. Most of their early games just did not look next generation. And that right there leads us straight back into the real story behind the Jaguar struggles. Because the reason that those early games looked underwhelming wasn't about bits at all. It was about the hardware, the tools, the documentation, and the development nightmares waiting behind the scenes. And that, my friends, is where the Jaguar story starts to unravel. You know, Rob, the Jaguar is the perfect example of a system with big ideas, but complicated tools behind the curtain. It promised the future, but actually building anything for it was, well, a nightmare.
Yeah, you practically needed a degree in engineering just to get a sprite moving. Imagine trying to make a podcast that way.
Exactly. And that's why I choose to use Zencaster. It's an all in one podcasting platform that doesn't make you wrestle with confusing hardware or setups. You just log in from your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video.
Well, that already sounds easier than programming the Jaguar's GPU, but what if something crashes? Atari wasn't exactly handing out backup systems.
Well, that's the beauty of it. Zencaster has multi layered backups. Even if your connection hiccups, your recording stays safe and the highest quality. No lost work, no headaches.
And editing? Tell me I don't have to wrangle code just to remove a few awkward pauses.
Nope. Zencaster's post production tools handle that automatically, trimming filler words, cleaning background noise, and balancing your audio. It's like having a full engineering team smoothing everything out for you.
And once I've made something good, how do I get it out there? Atari's distribution strategy wasn't exactly the golden standard.
Well, that's what makes Zencaster great as well. You can distribute your podcast directly to all the major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcast right from the same dashboard. Record, polish, publish, all in one place.
So, podcasting without the hardware meltdowns and developer nightmares sounds like the opposite of the Jaguar.
Exactly. Just go to zencaster.com/pricing. Use our offer code MemoryCardLane for 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. It's time to share your story, listeners, without the struggle.
So, if you've been wanting to make a show, grab that discount and get started the easy way.
That's right. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code, all one word, MemoryCardLane, and you'll get 30% off your first month.
And now, let's plug back into the Jaguar's Tangled development.
So when the Jaguar finally hit store shelves, first in limited test markets like New York and San Francisco in late 1993, and then more broadly in 1994, it arrived with a ton of hype and a very small library of games. And Rob, it did not take long for the cracks to show. Because the people who bought the Jaguar early weren't just buying a console, they were buying into Atari's promise that this was the future, that this was actually a leap past Sega and Nintendo, that they did the math. This was the first true 64-bit system. But when players actually hooked up the Jaguar and tried to launch all the titles, their reaction basically was, well, this looks like a Genesis game. Maybe a good Genesis game, but still a Genesis game. Now, Cybermorph, which is the pack-in title, did at least try to look next-gen with its flat-shaded 3D environments, but it also looked unfinished and ran inconsistently. Trevor McFur looked like something you'd expect on a 16-bit console. Raiden, straight port of the arcade game. And frankly, the rest of the early lineup didn't do much to convince skeptics that Atari's 64-bit slogan was anything more than a marketing spin. Now, to be fair, Atari knew that this was a problem. They insisted that the real power of the system would show up once developers spent more time with the hardware. They promised that bigger, better games were coming, games that would take full advantage of Tom and Jerry and show everyone what the Jaguar could really do. But those games didn't come quickly. And that brings us right back to the real heart of the problems. It wasn't the 64-bit math that genuinely held the Jaguar back at this point. It was everything under the hood. Because all of that complicated, confusing architecture that we talked about earlier, that landed like a brick in the middle of Atari's launch window. Depending on who at Atari you talk to, the GPU could act as the main CPU, or the DSP could act as the main CPU. And that poor Motorola 68000, the slowest processor in the system, was supposedly there just to quote unquote read the controller, right? And well, that was the idea. The reality was that most developers leaned in on the 68000 anyways, not because they wanted to, but genuinely because it was the only piece of the system that behaved predictably, that they knew, and that wasn't held together by unfinished tools and half-written documentation. And then came the hardware bug. The Jaguar's memory controller had a flaw that made it hard for RISC processors, which was the GPU and the DSP, Tom and Jerry, to reliably execute code from the RAM. Developers had to follow a set of obscure rules to make it work. If you forgot one detail or missed one quirk of said rules, the whole thing would crash, or worse, misbehave with no error messages.
I mean, isn't that just programming in a nutshell?
I mean, sure.
I said the number of times that's happened to me is kind of outrageous.
I want you to, for just a moment, imagine launching a brand new console and you're handing developers the following, right? 5 processors, incomplete manuals, unfinished tools, a finicky memory controller, and instructions telling them not to use the one processor that they actually understood.
I
Of,
mean, life.
of course, their early library looked rough. Of course, the games didn't match the hardware's potential. And of course, because of all this, the excitement around the Jaguar started fading almost as soon as it left the gate. But it wasn't because the Jaguar was weak. It wasn't weak. It wasn't underpowered. It wasn't some entirely dishonest fake 64-bit system. It had power. It had 64-bit memory buses. I mean, there was some truth to all of it. But it was simply too complicated. It was too underdocumented. It was too buggy. And it was too undersupported for most studios to handle circa 1993, 1994. Tom and Jerry offered a lot of horsepower, frankly, but the road to actually using it was long, steep, and full of potholes. And frankly, very few developers ever made it to the top. Now, to be fair to the Jaguar, not everything was doom and gloom. Every console has at least a few moments where you can see what the designers were going for, and the Jaguar had those flashes of brilliance. The brightest flash of all came from Jeff Minter's Tempest 2000. If there was one game that made the Jaguar feel like it might live up to the Atari's promise, it was this one. Tempest 2000 wasn't just a facelift of the arcade classic, it was genuinely a full evolution of the formula. It was fast, it was psychedelic, it was stylish, and genuinely just technically impressive. It proved that somebody out there could make the Jaguar sing if they were brave enough to tangle with Tom and Jerry directly. Reviewers loved it, fans loved it. For a lot of Jaguar owners, this was the game they showed their friends to justify the console. It wasn't alone. I had my first experience with one of the others, which was a game called Alien vs. Predator. That was a first person shooter that did something unheard of at the time. It gave players 3 different campaigns, each with its own style. That delivered an atmosphere and an experience that was really, it felt really ambitious for 1994. You know my best friend Jeremy. Jeremy had an Atari Jaguar, and we played it at his house. Actually, I think his brother had it, and we played it at his house, and it was fun. It was great. Like it wasn't mind blowing. I don't remember it being like, oh my god, this is the future. Like I felt when first time I saw Mario 64, you know. But I do remember being excited to have a new system, and Alien versus Predator was kind of cool.
Yeah, I definitely don't remember that console. Definitely did not exist by the time
No, it
I was old
definitely
enough to see you guys hanging out.
no, no, it did not. No, no, you came along in the PlayStation era. Alien vs. Predator was slower than PC shooters. It was a little rough around the edges, but it did show off a vision of what next gen horror and first person shooting gameplay could look like. These games, along with a couple of other smaller successes, proved that the Jaguar could be impressive. But they also really highlighted the system's biggest problem. For every Jeff Minter or Rebellion team that figured out the hardware, there were dozens of other studios that couldn't, that wouldn't, or simply didn't have the time to do so. And unfortunately, a console can't survive on just a handful of hits alone. So, as 1994 rolled into 1995, Atari found itself in an increasingly difficult spot. The initial promise of the Jaguar had faded by that point. The novelty of 64-bit power was wearing thin. Players were getting restless. They didn't buy a next generation system to play a couple of gems surrounded by an entire library that looked like it belonged on a 16-bit console. And all the while, the rest of the video game industry was speeding ahead without them, right? The Saturn was here at that point. The PlayStation was launching. Sega and Sony were rolling into the fifth generation with these systems, like fully armed battleships, and Atari was basically trying to patch holes in a canoe. So Atari did what Atari often did in the 90s. Instead of fixing the foundation, they started adding more pieces onto the house. Their first big effort was the Jaguar CD, released in 1995. Because if we know anything about the mid 90s, we know that CD-ROM gaming was booming, and Atari didn't want to be left behind.
Well, CDs in general were booming, Dave. I mean, you got the Sony Walkman.
So in late 95, they released a bulky top mounted add on that looked like it was trying to eat the base console. In theory, the CDs gave the Jaguar more storage and more potential, but the reality of it is that that add on arrived with barely any games, only 11 officially released during its actual production run, and none of them solved any of the problems with the original Jaguar hardware. It did have a standout feature called the virtual light machine that was built into it. That was made by Jeff Minter. It was cool. It was trippy, very Jeff Minter. But a music visualizer, which is what it was, wasn't going to save the Jaguar in itself. Next came the Jaguar Dual. That was eventually called the Jaguar 3, with the CD being the Jaguar 2, so to speak. That was Atari's vision for a sleeker all-in-one system that combined the Jaguar and the Jaguar CD into basically a single modernized console. Jaguar Duo made it to the Consumer Electronics Show in 1995, where wherein journalists basically described it looking like a bathroom scale. But still, it represented a course correction, right? The recognition, rather, that the original two-piece setup wasn't sustainable in the long term. But before manufacturing could begin on the Duo, Atari pulled the plug. Because frankly, by that point, they were a struggling company. There was no money, there was no momentum, and there was no developer interest left to justify finishing the console. And then there was the Jaguar VR.
Wait, so there's no money, but they had a whole nother thing to try.
Yeah. For the VR, Atari partnered with Virtuality, that was the king of early 90s arcade VR, to build a headset. Atari showed prototypes at CES. For a brief moment, Atari genuinely believed that maybe VR could be the thing that put the Jaguar back on the map. Unfortunately, only one game was ever developed for it. It was a 3D update of Missile Command called Missile Command 3D. Someone made a demo of a game called Zone Hunter, and that was it. that was it. 2 games. The whole project collapsed when Atari backed out of their deal with Virtuality in late 95. The same time that, by that point, everything at Atari was beginning to crumble. Each of these add-ons, the CD unit, the Duo, the VR, they were all attempts to keep up with what at the time was a rapidly evolving market, but they all had the same problem. Like I said, they didn't fix the Jaguar's core issues. The hardware was still confusing, the documentation still incomplete, the development tools were rough, and most developers had already moved on to other platforms that made their lives easier. Atari needed software hits. They needed developer support. They needed more time, but what they had were peripherals, expensive ones at that, late ones, and in some cases, unfinished ones. And frankly, none of them were enough. By late 95, the writing on the wall wasn't just visible, it was literally like blinking in neon, right? Even with the Jaguar CD, the Duo, all this stuff, Atari couldn't hide the truth anymore. They just couldn't keep up with everyone else. Sega and Sony were just rolling into the American market with consoles that were more powerful by this point, easier to develop for, and backed by marketing budgets that Atari couldn't hope to match with what little money they had left. And the sales numbers made the situation painfully clear. The Atari hadn't just stalled by this point, it had practically stopped moving. According to industry trackers, by the end of 1995, the Jaguar's market share was effectively 0%. Not low,
Oh,
not negligible, Rob. 0.
wow.
It was actually doing worse than the 3DO, and the 3DO was already seen as the industry's sinking ship.
That's something. 0%. Wow.
0%. Meaning, like, maybe someone bought one off a shelf somewhere, but that was about it. Inside Atari, morale was collapsing. Layoffs were hitting hard. Developers reported that their contacts at Atari just stopped answering emails. Studios working on Jaguar projects quietly shelved their games because no one was sure that anyone at Atari would still be around to approve them. And while Atari was still publicly insisting that everything was fine, that new games were coming, that the platform was still alive, its financial filings were telling a very different story. Between 1994 and 1995, Atari's revenue dropped by more than half. Worse, by the end of 1995, Atari admitted that it had sold around 125,000 Jaguar consoles, but still had nearly 100,000 units sitting in the warehouse. When your leftover inventory almost matches your entire customer base, you know you're in deep trouble. The Jaguar wasn't just failing at that point, it was actively dragging Atari down with it. So, in November of 1995, Atari effectively abandoned the console. The rest of the year and the start of 1996 was spent liquidating inventory, canceling projects, and preparing for the inevitable. That inevitability arrived on April 8th, 1996, when Atari agreed to merge with JTS, a hard drive manufacturer, in a reverse takeover. The Atari name survived on paper, but the company behind the Jaguar, the company that pioneered arcade gaming and pioneered home consoles, was gone at that point. And just like that, Atari bowed out of the hardware business that it helped to create. But strangely enough, that wasn't the end of the Jaguar. After the merger, a lot of leftover hardware ended up in the hands of liquidators, and that's how the Jaguar kind of had a second life as it found its way into the hands of collectors, hobbyists, and eventually homebrew developers. Then something particularly interesting happened in its history. Telegames is a publisher that refused to let the console die. They kept releasing new Jaguar games long after Atari disappeared from the scene. For a long time, they were the only company releasing Jaguar games. It wasn't wave after wave of releases, but it was enough here and there to keep a tiny community engaged. Then, in 1999, something even bigger happened. Hasbro, which by that point had acquired Atari's remaining intellectual property, announced that it was releasing all Jaguar patents into the public domain. And so at that point, the Jaguar became, for all intents and purposes, an open platform. Anyone could develop for it. Anyone could publish games. Anyone could finish abandoned prototypes. And they did. Companies like Songbird Productions stepped in to release unfinished games, create new ones, and keep the spirit of the Jaguar alive for what was now a growing cult audience. And one of the most bizarre twists out of any of these stories we've told so far, the Jaguar even returned to retail stores in the UK. Through a deal with the game chain, Telegames sold brand new Jaguars for $29.99 in 2001, years after the console had actually been discontinued. They stayed on shelves until 2007, when the remaining systems were finally sold off for $10 a piece, and the games were priced as low as 97 cents.
I mean, that might even be a lot to some people.
Imagine Rob buying a Jaguar the same year that the Xbox 360 had Gears of War on store shelves.
Yeah, that's insane.
Only Atari really could deliver a plot twist like that.
Yeah, that's just wild.
Today, to be fair, the Jaguar occupies one of those weird, fascinating places in the retro gaming world. It's not really remembered for its sales. It's not really remembered for its library. It's more so remembered because it dared to be different, and mostly because it represents Atari's last big swing at the world it once dominated. You're curious about the Jaguar. If you want to revisit its history, explore its oddball library, and finally see what the fuss was all about, you actually still can in 2025. 3 years ago, Atari released Atari 50. We've talked about it before. An absolutely phenomenal piece of software, an interactive museum collection, if you will. It brings several Jaguar games back in modern playable form. Now, the controls have had to been reworked to fit modern hardware. Honestly, the history is lovingly presented, and the whole thing gives the Jaguar something that it never really had during its own lifetime, which is a chance to be appreciated. So,
Damn.
frankly, if you've ever wanted to experience this strange, ambitious, undeniably unique console for yourself, you can. Atari 50 is a fantastic. If you're into classic games, it's the best classic game collection I've ever seen. It's got videos and artwork and reviews from people who made the games, and it's done so in such a fantastic. It's literally an interactive museum. It's so cool. Of course, Rob, the Jaguar isn't the first time we've talked about a landmark console on this show. If today's trip stirred up some nostalgia for the Atari glory days, you can always go back and revisit episode 210, where we dove into the system that started it all for them, the Atari 2600. If you really want to go back to where console gaming began, we covered the Magnavox Odyssey, which is the first home game console ever, way back in episode 105. If you'd rather jump forward a few decades instead, we recently looked at another major console launch in episode 220 when we explored the origins of the Microsoft Xbox. You can, of course, find all of those episodes anywhere you get your podcasts or by visiting our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can listeners find on our website?
You can find the calendar for our future episode topics, to know what we'll be talking about in our upcoming episodes. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I about topics or other possible topics. Who knows? You don't know. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor. And Dave?
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've covered places. Just if we can tie it to video game history, we're going to roll with it. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning, and in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I obviously learned about the Jaguar, considering I had no prior knowledge about it. Just not even a consideration in my brain. Never knew it was a thing. I do think it's kind of crazy though that it had that slight revival right at the end with the Xbox 360. Like that's not something you hear about consoles being sold brand new years 20, 30 years after their release, 10 even 10 years. Like I could see a resale shop. That makes sense. But to be selling them new and at 97 cents,
Yeah,
I mean, come on. The game, like I don't even know about even I can't remember a time that I could buy a game for $1. Like,
I know. When I saw that, it's hard to think about that there was a console on the shelf for $10. $10 are what you buy those cheap things that you hook a TV up to nowadays. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, exactly.
and here we had a full fledged gaming console that, to be fair, was probably as strong as those plug into the TV things at that point. But the point is it's hard to imagine a full fledged console on shelves for $10 like that. But they still
Yeah,
have
the
it
whole
left
thing
over.
is just crazy to me. So that's my takeaway. What about yourself?
I remember the Jaguar, as I said, my best friend had it. We got to play it, but you never quite, when, I mean, I would have been, what, 10, 11, 12 at the time? Don't ever quite understand the what, the where, and the why, right? So now when I look back, it makes sense why it wasn't as mind melting as the Mario 64, why it had everything felt weird and complicated and unfinished and unoptimized, I guess is a good way to put it nowadays. Like I never understood the complexity of it. I also, when you're that age, you don't understand the do the math concept, right? You just see 64-bit and you buy into it and you read the questions. Like I remember reading in magazines where people made the debate over whether or not it was a real 64-bit machine. But until really sitting down here to look at the Jaguar, I mean, let's be honest, I never thought about the system ever again after the 90s, for starters. But aside from that, uh, I never gave much thought over that argument at all, like, and never looked at what was actually in the system. So this was a fun opportunity to like learn the ins and outs of the system, and I enjoyed this story very much. So, all right, well, Rob, that will wrap it up for our story. Well, before I wrap up our story, rather, and lead into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us, and we appreciate you joining. So thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very, very much. When you look back at the Atari Jaguar, it's easy to focus on what went wrong: the complicated hardware, the unfinished tools, the struggling launch library, the desperate add ons, all these things that just kept it from ever becoming the next big leap in gaming. But underneath all that, the Jaguar really represents something that's just as important to gaming history as any breakout success. That is the willingness to take a chance. Atari didn't play it safe. They didn't ease into the 16-bit era or quietly follow the trends of the early 90s. They swung for the fences with a machine built on custom processors, experimental architecture, and a belief that they could leapfrog the competition in one bold move. It didn't work out the way they hoped, but ambition rarely makes for a smooth story. And yet, even after Atari left the hardware market, even after the Jaguar disappeared from store shelves, it still found a second life through hobbyists, through collectors, and through fans who saw potential in the machines that most of the world had written off. I mean, that's the funny thing about gaming history. Even the commercial failures can leave a legacy if enough people care to keep them alive. So today we didn't just talk about a console. We talked about a moment in time, a final act from a company that helped create this entire industry, and a reminder that innovation doesn't always look like success on a sales chart. Sometimes it looks like a strange controller, a pair of chips named Tom and Jerry, a whole lot of ambition, and a story that continues long after the company behind it is gone. Next week, we're trading the Jaguar's complicated hardware for something a little more low tech, but no less fascinating, the Nintendo e reader. Released for the Game Boy Advance in 2002, this quirky peripheral let players swipe real trading cards to unlock games, items, levels, and surprises long before Toys to Life was a buzzword. It blended physical collectibles with digital rewards in a way only Nintendo could dream up, leaving behind a weird, wonderful legacy that still pops up in the unexpected corners of gaming history. So join us as we scan through the rise, the fall, and the lasting influence of the e-reader on next week's unique trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Bibbidi-bop-bop-bop-boo-ah.